Welcome back to another episode of the DailyFlip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including one talking about how Ukraine actually hid some of its plans, most of its plans to invade Russia, and then two talking about Biden administration policies that have not necessarily worked out in their favor, getting some criticism. One got struck down, the other one is being heavily criticized by people in Washington. And, of course, we will end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive. I'm ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling for me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. So at this point, with the Ukraine war continuing and Ukraine opening a new front inside Russia, should we still be supporting it? This episode, we're going to be delving into the fact that Ukraine didn't disclose information to us or any of the other allies, and it really raises a question, which is if we're going to give as much logistical support as we are, should we know everything? Probably not, because at the end of the day, that looks like we are directly controlling what they can do. If we were providing advice on the minutia, then it basically looks like we're directing the war effort. But at the same time, if they're going to use the weapons that we provide for them, like the F-16s, to actually invade into a country, that implicates us as well. It draws us even further into the conflict. So these are the questions that we're going to actually delve into today. But I want to hear your opinions. Throw it down there in the comment section. Let's jump to our first article that comes from Business Insider. Ukraine says it kept its plans from Kursk offensive secret, even from the Pentagon. Here's why. And I'm going to be honest, it doesn't necessarily feel like they're justifying, or Business Insider, at least in the headline, is justifying what Ukraine did, but they kind of just leave it out there like, oh, yeah, they just hid it from the U.S., they hid it from the Pentagon, which it gives me a sense of unease, because at the end of the day, if you're looking at the political messaging, Vladimir Putin's going to be sitting over there and saying, look, he got all this stuff from Biden, he got all this stuff from the United States, and while they have plausible deniability that they didn't necessarily get the plans, they weren't there planning how they were going to invade Russia, they knew that at the end of the day, if you give this technology to Ukraine, they at least have the means to do this, and they use it and go and escalate. This is only a possibility with the technology and the aid and all the military equipment provided by the United States. So you're actually giving, even though you're taking something away from Putin in that, oh, well, we have the most insight as to what's going on there. If he was to make an argument that we're really involved in the logistical planning, and they did really keep this secret from the Pentagon, and we don't find out years later that we actually were involved in some way, then you're taking away that lever. But at the same time, you're opening up the fact that no longer is it solely a defensive war, but rather one where they've gone on the offensive into the other person's territory, which makes sense in war. I'm not going to deny that. But at the end of the day, it puts the U.S. in a really, really sticky situation. So let's actually jump into what the article opens with. Quote, Zelensky spoke as the incursion entered its third week, saying Ukraine controlled 91 settlements in almost 500 square miles of territory in the western Russian region. The operations planning was kept a secret from the West because, quote, many representatives of the international community would have said that it was unrealistic and crossed Russia's main red line, end quote. Which, this has come from Zelensky himself. He's not wrong. I mean, at the end of the day, if I'm the leader of Ukraine and I am trying to stop this offensive, I'm trying to gain a little bit more leverage, and I'm trying to protect my sovereignty as a nation, protect my people, make sure that we are free going into the future, and I want to have a settlement agreement, I want to have some negotiation. Yeah, I want to grab some territory from the other side of the border and say, hey, look, you know what, give us our territory back, you will get your territory back. That's fair enough. And at the end of the day, he says, yeah, I don't want to necessarily relay this information to the people that are backing us, our allies, because they're not going to like it. They're going to hate on it. They're going to say it's not possible. They're not going to throw their support behind it. They may even claim that they want to get rid of military aid. And then at the end of the day, we might not even be able to win anything back or push back the army enough in order to actually bring them to the table and make sure that the Russians give them a fair ceasefire deal. But you also remember, if you're an analyst, a strategic analyst for the United States, and you're sitting down at the table with Zelensky, You're saying, hey, why aren't you letting us in on this sort of information? How can we be assured that you're not going to cross, exactly as Zelensky said, that red line that Russia has put on the ground, and then Russia retaliates not just against you, but against us? Because guess what? Like I've said a million times, at least enough times during this, we supplied some of the munitions and some of the different technical capabilities that were used in order to cross said red line. So remember during World War II, guess what happened when the U.S. kept supporting Britain? Eventually, Mr. Adolf got really, really tired of it, and he basically declared war on the United States, saying, you're already tacitly involved. You're providing material support. You keep shipping them weapons. You keep trying to get them aid. So at some point, I'm not saying that Putin is going to do that because I think he's a relatively rational actor. We're also in an age of nuclear war, so do you actually want to have two nuclear powers actually on the ground and going to absolute desperate ends in order to win? No. But you can't ignore the past. You cannot look at the past and say, oh, no, that is not what's going to happen here. Just totally disregard it. You still have to take this into account because when we forget the lessons of the past, we are bound to repeat them. I know you've heard that a million times. If you grew up any time after the collapse of the Soviet Union and you've talked about hegemonic power and how the United States is one, everybody says, hey, you need to look into the past. What happens when there's hegemons? What happens when another hegemon rises, like China? You run into the Thucydides trap. So this has definitely been a theme of the early 2000s because even the U.S. made mistakes that it had previously made and Russia had previously made when trying to invade Afghanistan. All these sort of things, all these mistakes, all these historical lessons were not necessarily learned. So to sit back this time and say, well, you know what? Just like the last few times we made these mistakes, the last time we ignored history, well, it was right then, but it's not right now. We have to seriously reevaluate what is going on. Where is our money going? Why are we not being put in on these plans? And see that, okay, so you might be sitting here saying, well, Alex, I thought you wouldn't want to be involved in the plans because it adds culpability. My thing is, it's already our arms there. So we might as well be in on the plans. And I think we should be in all the plans. And I think it makes sense because there are arms, but we should be in on the plans. We should be in on the logistics. We should be understanding where our resources are going so that we're not crossing any Russian red lines. But then also, because of the fact that our arms are being used in these situations, and if they're misused, we're going to get blamed, we need to be in on the decision-making process so then we can actually be held accountable. Because guess what? The worst of both worlds is we keep supplying the aid and Ukraine doesn't tell us what they're doing because then we are just susceptible to basically whatever they do. We can try to claim, oh, hey, there's no accountability here. But from the other side, from Russia's perspective, they can say, well, hey, I mean, you're not necessarily telling them exactly what they can do, but you're definitely enabling it. You've seen their aggressive moves here. It doesn't help with the messaging. If we're directly involved and we're holding them back, basically we're saying, hey, Ukraine, we got this chain here, not to use a terrible analogy, but they're basically a dog on a chain. And Ukraine is not a fierce pit bull that's going to absolutely destroy Russia if we let go of the chain. I'm not trying to make an illusion like that. But the fact that we're holding them back, we can at least use that as a strategic lever to say, hey, Russia, come to the table. We've been holding them back this entire time. But that's not the policy at this point. The policy is we have to embarrass Putin. He's already invaded into Ukraine. We have to pretend. We have to posture. We have to weaken him. We have to ruin the resolve within the Russian country and also try to devastate their economy. Guess what? Their war economy is booming at this point. They're still losing a drastic number of lives. There's no doubt about that. But Ukraine is too. So at this point, you start to wonder, okay, where is that? Everybody talked about it. Where's the strategic off-ramp? And guess what? Israel started to happen. The election's starting to really take off. So all these stories just head to the background. And when I read this from Business Insider, I was like, why is this not being reported more? At the end of the day, you had your pro-peace left, you had your pro-peace right, both coming out and saying, hey, this is not something that we can accept. We need to try to get out of Ukraine. We need to stop giving them weapons, especially the new right. You had so many of them coming and saying, no, okay, we should not send our money over there. And it has just been lost to the background. And when you see stories like this, which is everybody complained that we're sending stuff over there and that we didn't have enough strategic oversight. We didn't know where the money was going. We didn't know if there was corruption happening. This is the largest example of not having any insight to what's going on in the country. And it's not even that, oh, well, a little bit of money's getting skimmed here or there. This was an intentional plan. Zelensky literally says, we're not going to tell them. We didn't tell the Pentagon because they would thought that we were going to get involved, that we were going to say no, that it was unrealistic, which, I mean, apparently it wasn't unrealistic because they did take some territory in Russia. Fair enough to Zelensky. He's defending his nation, but at the end of the day, he's doing it with our tax dollars. He is doing it with our weapons. He is doing it with our material support. And why? Why do we have to be there? I know people that have gone over there for strategical support. Why do we have to be using our blood, our treasure? And I say our blood. I'm not saying we're sending soldiers over there, but we're still having a lot of people that we are sending strategic officers over there. We are risking the lives of Americans who have to fly some of this material or cash into the country. So at the end of the day, we really have to step back. Do we trust our partner in this? Do we trust the Ukrainians to be a good partner, a good advocate? Are they actually a good ally? Now, I'm sure you can make an argument that we wouldn't be a good ally if we back down from them. That's fair enough. But guess what? If we're going to be their ally and we're going to bring something to the table, they got to bring something to the table themselves. They are fighting Ukraine. They are spending their blood and treasure on it too. There's no doubt about that. But also, if they're a dishonest actor in this process, how can you ever trust that they will actually do what they promise to do, that they won't provoke Russia beyond a certain point that we cannot necessarily come back from? And I'm not trying to be risk averse. I'm not trying to say, oh, okay, at the end of the day, we can't necessarily be getting involved in this. I'm fully aware that there are justified means for war. There are risks that you have to take. I do not think Russia-Ukraine is one of them. I understand that having access to a warm water port is something that Russia really, really wants, and actually having access to that more right-hand side of Ukraine also allows them to have a little bit more control over some of the agricultural markets. Guess what? The United States, we subsidize agriculture all the time. I don't think we're going to necessarily worry about that as much. I think them having a warm water port is actually not going to be the end of the world, especially as the Arctic tends to open up, and they're actually they're trying to build a strategic pathway for all their different icebreaker ships and normal trade ships to get through anyway. So at the end of the day, if you really want to make the warm water port, maybe they need it now, but give it 30 years, they're not going to need it whatsoever. It's not going to be strategically valuable because the Arctic, the ice is going to melt, and there are going to be new trade routes there. So I honestly think, and I do not have all the security briefings that everybody else has, because guess what? Some people go in, like Mike Johnson goes in behind the closed doors. He goes into the skiff and he comes out. Yep. Oh, I take my position back. I take it back. We need to be all in on Russia. I haven't seen those briefings. I have not gone into a skiff, but the fact that we're at least not covering this. Am I going to have all the answers? No, I'm not. I am not going to pretend that I know everything. I think I've laid out some pretty interesting arguments here for why we don't necessarily need to be involved, or at least if we're going to be more involved, we need to understand what's happening and we need to trust our ally in the process. But the fact that this isn't being talked about more, that this is not is not on the front page of every major newspaper, that it is not in the New York Times, and it is running across the top of the LA Times over on the West Coast, and it hasn't been repeated over and over again. It just shows, one, how much the American people don't want to think about this anymore, but also the fact that we've just passed on. There's more important things. And if there are more important things, then why are we continuing to support it like we did at the very beginning? Even though the passion's not there, we're giving just as much money, if not a little bit less. We put a few little guide rails on the edge to try to make sure the money doesn't go the wrong place. Fair enough. We try to do something. But this should be the top story, and that is why it is leading the podcast today, because when I read this, it put a giant pit in my stomach, and I think it would do the same for most people when it's like saying that Britain, you know what, we're going to provide you this for your war effort, and at the end of the day, we're going to say you can't use it here, here, and here. And Britain's a little different. They had their own war machine. They were their own self-sufficient country for the most part. Then again, they did need us because they were an island nation, but they at least had enough of an industry that they weren't relying on us for most of their major weapons. It was a little bit later on that happened to be the case, but Ukraine from the very beginning has needed to rely on our weapons, and they basically needed us to prop them up this entire time. And it would be like saying to Britain, okay, those aircraft that we gave you, it's fine if you try to defend your own shores. It's fine if you go and try to take back France. But, going into the actual heartland of Germany, that is a no-go. We didn't say that at the time, and we didn't at the end of the day. We did put restrictions on it at the beginning with Ukraine, and we've slowly walked them back. But we have made it very clear from the very essence of this conversation that there are red lines that you cannot cross, that going into Russian territory, giving them certain missiles to bomb Russian refineries and places where they process the different oil, natural gas is a no-go. The fact that certain nuclear plants have been fought over, and we've been deeply concerned about it. There are even teams from international communities that go to these different plants and make sure that they're running okay. There have been obvious barriers put up, and that is why. It even proves it in the very statement that Zelensky made, which is, we didn't want to tell anybody because they wouldn't approve. It would be a problem. They would try to restrict us. That the whole fact that they had to go around that system means that it wasn't something that would have been allowed, that wouldn't have gone without some sort of conversation that was meant to dissuade them from doing it. This should be leading all the headlines. Share it with your friends. Put it out there, because at the end of the day, we love Ukraine, apparently. Oh, we absolutely love them when they're hemmed in, when they are on our side, when we're actually supporting them, and they're doing things that are not going to evoke a wider war and possibly pull us into it. At least that seems to be the narrative. Oh, they're fighting over there, so we don't have to go fight. Is this something that's actually going to stop the fighting and stop our boys from having to go over there? I don't know. Right now, it doesn't necessarily look like that, but you never know. Guess what? These things can always devolve. But hey, we've talked about that one enough. Let's jump into some of the Biden policies that have been revoked or strike down. The first one is actually the non-compete. A judge, actually, I'll just read you the headline, comes from Newsmax. Judge strikes down Biden ban on worker non-competes. So non-compete pacts. I've gone back and forth on this because I think that some non-competes are genuinely very, very chock full of details and different clauses that are meant to absolutely hamstring anybody from going out and participating in the market again and preventing them from having any possibilities besides at the company they're at right now. I also understand why they exist from a business perspective. If you have trade secrets, if you have a really good logistical system, a really good supply chain, and there's a little secret sauce that you have that another company doesn't have, you don't necessarily want those trade secrets to get out to somebody else, your competitor. So you want to put in non-competes so the people that leave your company can't just go and use that knowledge that they gained from you and go into another company. And at the end of the day, it is part of a contract. It's basically a contract that you as a employee sign with the employer. And I think that those contracts should not be interfered with by the government. They should be enforced by the government. They should not be interfered with by the government. But I also do understand the perspective that, hey, if you're basically a software engineer who specializes in a really specific thing, and there's only one company, let's say Google has bought up and you can make an argument about monopolization here, maybe breaking it up due to antitrust, but let's say that Google has bought up all of the specific software companies that you would want to work at because they are trying to build out the infrastructure of this one thing, and you're super specialized, so you can only really work there. And you sign a non-compete, and you don't really think it's a big deal because there is no competition. Google's the only really name in town at the end of the day. And then a year later, you're trying to get out because there's some competition that started to bloom. You've seen, okay, hey, maybe at Google I can't necessarily move up. At this other place I could, and then you try to leave, and this really strict non-compete, at the time you signed it because you thought it was totally okay. Hey, I don't see any other problems with this. There's not really any competition, like I said at the beginning. And now there's overly restrictive clauses that will actually prevent you from going to that other place and will basically hamstring you in that one job, or basically in unemployment, or not in the field that you want to be in. I do understand this for sure. Do I think it's the government's place to come in and say, no, we're not allowed to do this? No, I think at the end of the day, if you're going to have a non-compete clause like that, maybe we should make it culturally acceptable so that the person says, okay, if you're going to have a really strict non-compete like this, based on if you're fired, that's a different thing because you can be fired for a breach of intellectual property and things like that. So maybe the non-compete can have special clauses there, and then you have to decide whether or not someone's fairly fired. That can be done in a court of law. It doesn't have to be done by the National Labor Relations Board. But yeah, we love our bureaucracy. We create a whole bunch of different boards for this. But the point being that if you actually leave, maybe there's a very generous, along with the non-compete, it's if you have a non-compete, you will still be paid approximately 50% of your salary during the time that you can't actually work in this specific field unless you find another job that is equivalent, or you find another job in a different sector and then you hold yourself over without any of that pay. I think that could be an interesting middle ground. I think if you're a high value employee, if you're a really high value employee, this doesn't necessarily affect you as much, because at the end of the day, you can negotiate a lot more. If you're really desperate for this job and you're like, oh, I have to sign a non-compete, I have to sign a non-disclosure agreement, I really need this, so on and so forth. If you're a very high value employee and you have a track record of doing things and they really want you, then it is extremely hard to pin them down with some of these things without getting some sort of benefit, without getting extra pay, things like this, because you have a little bit more negotiating power. And that is the interesting thing about the free market. The people who have the skills, who put in the effort, who put in the time, who develop those extra things, those little extra pieces of magic that make them more appealing, they're going to get a better deal than the people that are a little bit more desperate because they don't necessarily have any other options. But like I said at the very beginning, you do have the choice to not sign that non-compete. But that's enough about the actual morality, the ethical questions of non-competes. Let's jump into what is actually happening here, because the national relations, sorry, I take that back. Biden has expanded the pro-union policies and the pro-worker policies. And yes, I'm using his word, pro-worker policies. And he sees this as part of that pro-worker agenda. But now a judge is saying, no, you can't just outright ban all non-competes. Quote, U.S. District Judge Ada Brown in Dallas said the FTC, which enforces federal antitrust laws, does not have the authority to ban practices it deems unfair methods of competition by adopting broad rules. So you'll love the little nuance that she provides here. Brown had temporarily blocked the rule in July while she considered a bid by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the country's largest business lobby, and the tax service firm Ryan to strike it down entirely. The rule was set to take effect September 4th. And I'm going to keep going here. Brown, in her ruling, said that even if the FTC had the power to adopt the rule, the agency had not justified banning virtually all non-compete agreements. So what she's getting at is maybe there should be a more focused approach to banning non-competes. I think that that's a completely valid point of view, and I would just be interested to see what she thinks is a more specific, targeted sort of approach. Would it be that you can't have clauses where people can't work for basically an entire year? Would it be 6 months or less? Would it be that you can go workplaces, but you can't take anything that would be considered intellectual property? I think that one, honestly, I think that would be the best, solely because at the end of the day, you can actually quantify what some intellectual property is if you have a copyright, if you have a patent on some of the technologies, and maybe in the future, if there's actually a way to verify certain processes as solely your own and like a trade secret, which there already are some legal gray areas for those sort of things, then maybe you can have those sort of non-competes, which would be standard anyway, but you just have it written down more formally. I think that could be an interesting middle ground that actually enforces and protects property rights rather than trying to dig out and how should I say, make the employee-employer relationship less steady and try to undermine it, essentially. These are all, this is me just brainstorming here, but it's very, very interesting. I would love to see what her approach is, but you can see here that she's basically coming in saying, FTC, antitrust, you can't necessarily go in there. You're trying to oversee these companies and you're trying to just outright ban the sort of agreements that these companies make. That is too heavy-handed. And like I said earlier, there is a very interesting conversation around companies like Google and other companies that are, I don't want to say necessarily monopolies, but they're the only places where you can do certain types of jobs. Because when you do have a non-compete in those sort of areas, then I understand why that is even more problematic. Because if you lose your job, then there's really not necessarily anywhere else you can go for it. And those small companies that are just building up, Google's basically said, hey, no, you can't go work for anybody else, and you can't help those small companies with the knowledge you have from our company, basically meaning they're stopping the competition from gaining intellectually from the people who actually have experience in the industry? I think these are all interesting questions, and they will definitely go forward, but this rule specifically has been shut down, and we'll definitely see lots of lawsuits coming out about this. Maybe not before Biden's out of office. Maybe he'll get one or two cases on the books. He'll have some of his attorneys, he'll have the FTC, and by his, I mean he'll deploy the FTC and say, hey, you guys really need to try to fix this. And if Kamala gets in, I'm sure this litigation will go on for quite some time. I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up in front of the Supreme Court. All right, so let's jump to the other policy from the Biden-Harris administration that hasn't necessarily gone over so well. The story comes from the Free Beacon. Biden-Harris admin gives Chinese-owned green energy facility free pass to NatSec, so national security, crackdown. And when I first read this, I was like, no, there's no way. Even if Biden really does love working with China, he has been just as hardline as Trump has. This is basically a consensus throughout most of Washington. And, as I've mentioned before, I am someone who is not afraid to say that they are more hawkish on China than anyone else around the world. But even with that sort of mentality, I was like, no, there's no way. Like, I'm not trying to say, oh, people don't go far enough. I actually think sometimes the unanimity around the issue does scare me, because when both sides of Washington are fully in agreement on something, normally it doesn't go well. When the people who have direct control over our lives all agree on something, that does give me hesitation. One of the great examples is stock trading. They always say, oh yeah, well, we should ban stock trading. They shouldn't be able to do it. And then nothing ever really gets passed. Excuse me. So, it does make me a little bit skeptical and questioning, but that doesn't mean that on the principles of the matter and the arguments of the matter, I think I could very well defend my position, as I've done many a times. But that's not the point. The point here is that there's a little bit of a hole in this legislation that actually benefits the Chinese government. And when I say that, I'm not saying that the Chinese government is actively taking advantage of this loophole. It just could be exploited. And I think, honestly, the article tries to frame it as, oh, this is a huge problem. We know something's happening. No. This is a potential security risk. It's not one yet, at least that we know of, and they're trying to prevent one. But like I said, the article's trying to drum it up and make it seem like, oh, well, it's happening now. And they're trying to do a little bit of fear mongering. So keep that in mind as we go through the first paragraph. Also, I'm going to leave all the links to all the articles in the description below the like and subscribe button, so you can go read them for yourself, because it's a little bit of a longer read than I'm going to get to in detail. Quote, under the proposed rules, federal officials would be able to conduct increased scrutiny over foreign transactions within 100 miles of more than 50 additional military installations nationwide, including the National Guard's Camp Gray located in Crawford County, Michigan. The rules, however, will not be enforced retroactively, allowing Goshen High Tech and its subsidiary Goshen Inc. to avoid further scrutiny. And what they're speaking about specifically. So I read what the actual policy will be. Now we're going to go back to the very first paragraph so it gives a little bit more of the context. The Biden-Harris administration recently proposed national security regulations would, as crafted, give a free pass to Goshen High Tech, a Chinese government-tied company developing an electric vehicle battery facility just 63 miles away from a sensitive military facility in northern Michigan. So let's be clear here. A National Guard camp is not necessarily a deep training location. It's not a laboratory where we're doing new tech. So is it really that huge of a deal? Not necessarily. But I think that we need to definitely take a second and really analyze what's going on here. Is there a possibility that Chinese companies have individuals who are working for the Chinese government? Very, very fair to ask that question, in my opinion, mainly because any company that operates within China has to have some CCP affiliation. Look at Jack Ma. He spoke out against the government, and he was kind of like a rebel beforehand, but he more directly spoke out against them cracking down on bank regulations, and then his Ant Financial got an absolute hammer to the face. He went missing for about 3.5 months. So in China, to pretend as though you can't not be associated with the CCP, that you can't not fall in line, would be silly to imply that. And is it possible that they're sending agents? Very well. It could be. But also, we need to really ask the question, which is, how much extra surveillance power are we giving to the government in order to look through their transactions to monitor these people? And could the technologies and the different processes that are used here on outside forces eventually be turned inwards? Yes, probably. So these are all very important questions. And it's not like we're monitoring outside of our nation. We are monitoring inside the United States. Then again, we let Chinese companies come and invest inside the United States. So, I mean, that's what happened. The question is, if you really want to stop this, stop foreign investment. Okay, if you really don't want to let any company have access to this secured information, or have people that are even more likely to be involved, aka Chinese citizens who are working at a Chinese company that possibly works with the CCP, don't let them into the country in the first place. Rather than saying, okay, we're going to let them into the country, but also then we're going to increase surveillance power. I think that would actually be an interesting one. I would definitely disagree with that for the most part, because at the end of the day, if you're going to put up trade restrictions like that, then they're not going to let American investors in there. We're not going to have any penetration into the market, which is going to be absolutely disastrous for a lot of the largest hedge funds on Wall Street. And also the state of innovation, because at the end of the day, even if we don't agree, there are different individuals that are trading technologies and innovating together. There are different partnerships between Chinese companies and American companies. So, I mean, Tesla being a great example of them. But it's like, oh, you kind of open this up for yourself, and then you're asking, well, hey, we said that it's okay for them to come invest here, but also we're going to try to crack down on them. I understand the national security implications. I'm not trying to pretend like they don't steal intellectual property on a normal basis, and that they wouldn't try to steal military information as well. But the question really does need to be, how much power do we want to give them? And at the end of the day, do we want to make sure that we have a secure America that could possibly use the technologies that it has used to secure the country on the people? Or do we want to have an open, free America, but possibly run a little bit more of a risk and not actually surveilling everybody? This is the battle of our time. How risky do we want to be? It's an interesting conversation. If you have any thoughts, throw them down in the comment section. But we've gone through all of our main articles. Let's jump to our Daily Delight. This one comes from Parade Pets. Headline reads, adorable... Chahuna joyful wiggles for Turtle Pal are too cute to resist. And I'm going to be honest, I don't think it's Chihuahua, because if that's how you spell Chihuahua, then I have been spelling it wrong my entire life. But I'll tell you now, it's a cute dog. There's no doubt about that. And the energy that this guy lets off, you honestly want to go watch this video just to get a little bit of a smile. You honestly hope that you could be this enthusiastic after a long day doing whatever you do. But then again, that's always why we look to our animals, our pets, to give us a little bit of extra joy at the end of the day. So, with all that said, if you want to check out any of today's articles, including the Daily Delight, like I just mentioned, everything is down in the description below that like and subscribe button. You can also find down there the link to the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. Also, remember, we have our global news segment, 6 and 6, that comes out on Tuesdays and Thursdays now as well. And with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.